and now estimating that there are in Maryland, Virginia, and other grain-growing states an aggregate of 2,000 slave owners who have cotton plantations stocked with Negroes in the far South and who have been entered more than once. We find, as the result of our calculations, that the total number of actual slaveholders in the Union is precisely 186,551 as follows. Number of actual slaveholders in the United States, 186,551. Number entered more than once, 2,000. Number of non-slaveholding slave hires, 158,974. Aggregate number, according to DeBow, 347,525. The greatest number of non-slaveholding slave hirers are a kind of third-rate aristocrats, persons who formerly owned slaves, but whom slavery, as it is custom, has dragged down to poverty, leaving them in their false shiftless pride to eke out a miserable existence over the hapless chattels personal of other men. So it seems that the total number of actual slave owners, including their entire crew of cringing lickspittles against whom we have to contend, is but 345,525. Again, this army, for the defense and propagation of slavery, we think it will be an easy matter, independent of the Negroes, who in 9 cases out of 10 would be delighted with the opportunity to cut their masters' throats, and without accepting of a single recruit from either of the free states, England, France, or Germany, to muster one at least 3 times as large and far more respectable for its utter extinction. We hope, however, and believe that the matter in dispute may be adjusted without arraying these armies against each other in hostile attitude. We desire peace, not war, justice, not blood. Give us fair play, secure to us the right of discussion, the freedom of speech, and we will settle the difficulty at the ballot box, not on the battleground, by force of reason, not force of arms. But we are wedded to one purpose from which no earthly power can ever divorce us. We are determined to abolish slavery at all hazards, in defiance of all the opposition of whatever nature which it is possible for the slavocrats to bring against us. Of this they may take due notice and govern themselves accordingly. Before we proceed further, it may be necessary to call attention to the fact that though the ostensible proprietorship of the slaves is vested in fewer individuals than we have usually counted in our calculations concerning them, the force and drift of our statistics remain unimpaired. In the main, all of our figures are correct. The tables which we have prepared especially, and the recapitulations of these tables, may be relied on with all the confidence that is due to American official integrity, for, as we have substantially remarked on a previous occasion, the particulars of which they are composed have been obtained from the returns of competent census agents who, with Professor DeVoe as principal, were expressly employed to collect them. As for our minor labors in the science of numbers, we cheerfully submit them to the candid scrutiny of the impartial critic. A majority of the slaveholders with whom we are acquainted, and we happen to know a few dozen more than we care to know, own or pretend to own at least 15 Negroes each. Some of them are the masters of more than 50 each. And we have had the honor of an introduction to one man who is represented as the owner of 1,600. It is said that if all the lands of this latter worthy were in one tract, they might be formed into 2 counties of more than ordinary size. He owns plantations and woodlands in 3 cotton-growing states. The quantity of land owned by the slaveholder is generally in proportion to the number of Negroes at his quarter. The master of only 1 or 2 slaves, if engaged in agriculture, seldom owns less than 300 acres. The holder of 8 or 10 slaves usually owns from 1,000 to 1,500 acres. 5,000 acres are not infrequently found in the possession of the master of 50 slaves. While in Columbia, South Carolina, about 12 months ago, a certain noted slaveholder was pointed out to us and reported as the owner of nearly 200,000 acres in the state of Mississippi. How the great mass of illiterate poor whites, a majority of whom are the indescribably wretched tenants of these slavocratic land sharks, are specially imposed upon and socially outlawed, we shall, if we have time, in space take occasion to explain in a subsequent chapter. Thus far, in giving expression to our sincere and settled opinion, we have endeavored to show, in the first place, that slavery is a great moral, social, civil, and political evil, a dire enemy to the true wealth and natural greatness, and an atrocious crime against both God and man, and in the second place, that it is paramount only which we owe to heaven, to the earth, to America, to humanity, to our posterity, to our consciences, and to our pockets, to adopt effectual and judicious measures for its immediate abolition. The question now arises, how can the evil be averted? What are the most prudent and practical means that can be devised for the abolition of slavery? In the solution of these problems, it becomes necessary to deal with a multiplicity of stubborn realities. And yet, we can see no reason why North Carolina in her sovereign capacity may not, with equal ease and success, do what 45 other states of the world have done within the last 45 years. Nor do we believe any good reason exists why Virginia should not perform as great a deed in 1859 as did New York in 1799. Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1780. Would it not be a masterly stroke of policy if Tennessee and every other slave state abolish it in or before 1860? Not long since, a slavocrat writing on the subject said apologetically, "We frankly admit that slavery is a monstrous evil, but what are we to do with an institution which has baffled the wisdom of our greatest statesmen?" Unfortunately for the South, since the days of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and their illustrious compatriots, she has never had more than half a dozen statesmen, all told. Of mere politicians, wire-pullers, and slave-driving demagogues she has had enough and to spare. But of statesmen in the truest sense of the term she has had, and now has, but precious few, fewer just at this time perhaps than ever before. It is far from a matter of surprise to us that slavery has, for such a long period, baffled the wisdom of the oligarchy, but our surprise is destined to culminate in amazement if the wisdom of the non-slaveholder does not soon baffle slavery. From the 11th year previous to the close of the 18th century down to the present moment, slaveholders and slave breeders, who, to speak naked truth, are as a general thing unfit to occupy any honorable station in life, have by chicanery and usurpation wielded all the official power of the South, and accepting the patriotic services of the noble abolitionists above mentioned, the sole aim and drift of their legislation has been to aggrandize themselves, to strengthen slavery, and to keep the poor whites, the constitutional majority, bowed down in the deepest depths of degradation. We propose to subvert this entire system of oligarchical despotism. We think there should be some legislation for decent white men, not alone for Negroes and slaveholders. Slavery lies at the root of all the shame, poverty, ignorance, tyranny, and imbecility of the South. Slavery must be thoroughly eradicated. Let this be done, and a glorious future will await us. The statesmen who are to abolish slavery in Kentucky must be mainly and independently constituted by the non-slaveholders of Kentucky. So in every other slave state, past experience has taught us the sheer folly of ever expecting voluntary justice from the slaveholders. Their illicit intercourse with the mother of harlots has been kept up so long, and their whole natures have in consequence become so degraded that there is scarcely a spark of honor or magnanimity to be found amongst them. As well might one expect to hear highwaymen clamoring for a universal inner edict against traveling as to expect slaveholders to pass laws for the abolition of slavery. Under all the circumstances, it is the duty of the non-slaveholders to mark out an independent course for themselves, to steer entirely clear of the oligarchy, and to utterly condemn and ignore the many vile instruments of power, animate and inanimate, which have been so freely and so effectually used for their enslavement. Now is the time for them to assert their rights and liberties. Never before was there such an appropriate period to strike for freedom in the South. Had it not been for the better sense, the pure patriotism, and the more practical justice of the non-slaveholders, the Middle States and New England would still be groaning and groveling under the ponderous burden of slavery. New York would never have risen above the dishonorable level of Virginia. Pennsylvania, trampled beneath the iron heel of the Black Code, would have remained under the unprogressive parallel of Georgia. Massachusetts would have continued to the present time, and heaven only knows how much longer, the contemptible co-equal of South Carolina. Succeeded by the happiest moral effects and the grandest physical results, we have seen slavery crushed beneath the wisdom of non-slaveholding statesmen of the North, followed by corresponding influences and achievements. Many of us who have not yet passed the meridian of life are destined to see it equally crushed beneath the wisdom of the non-slaveholding statesmen of the South. With righteous indignation, we enter our disclaimer against the base, yet baseless admission that Louisiana and Texas are incapable of producing as great a statesman as Rhode Island and Connecticut. What has been done for New Jersey by the statesmen of New Jersey can be done for North Carolina by the statesmen of North Carolina. The wisdom of the former state has abolished slavery. As sure as the earth revolves on its axis, the wisdom of the latter will not do less. Now, this was incorrect here, because what New Jersey had done was abolish slavery in 1846 for everybody born after the 4th of July, 1804, and those who had reached mature age. Thus, in New Jersey, slavery still technically existed, but it was not recorded in the United States Census. But as late as 1860, there was a notation that said the state of New Jersey had 18, what they called them indentured servants for life. And at the end of the Civil War, when the 13th Amendment was passed, the last 16 people were freed in the state of New Jersey. That was the last state to end slavery, so just so you know about that. Helper probably didn't know that when he was writing this. That our plan for the abolition of slavery is the best that can be devised, we have not the vanity to contend, but that it is a good one and will do to act upon until a better shall have been suggested, we do firmly and conscientiously believe, though but little skilled in the delicate art of surgery, we have pretty thoroughly probed slavery, the frightful tumor of the body politic, and have, we think, ascertained the precise remedies requisite for a speedy and perfect cure. Possibly the less ardent friends of freedom may object to our prescription, on the grounds that some of its ingredients are too gripping, and that it will cost the patient a deal of most excruciating pain, but let them remember that the patient is exceedingly refractory, and that the case is a desperate one, and that drastic remedies are indispensably necessary. When they shall have invented milder yet equally efficacious ones, it will be time enough to discontinue the use of ours. Then no one will be readier than we are to discard the infallible strong recipe for the infallible mild. Not at the persecution of a few thousand slaveholders, but at the restitution of natural rights and prerogatives to several millions of non-slaveholders do we aim. Inscribed on the banner which we herewith unfurl to the world, with the full and fixed determination to stand by it or die by it, unless one of more virtuous efficacy shall be presented, are the mottos which in substance embody the principles as we conceive that should govern us in our patriotic warfare against the most subtle and insidious foe that ever menaced the inalienable rights and liberties and dearest interests of America. First, thorough organization and independent political action on the part of the non-slaveholding whites of the South. Second, ineligibility of slaveholders, never another vote to the trafficker in human flesh. Third, no cooperation with the slaveholders in politics, no fellowship with them in religion, no affiliation with them in society. Fourth, no patronage to slaveholding merchants, no guestship in slave-waiting hotels, no fees to slaveholding lawyers, no employment of slaveholding physicians, no audience to slaveholding parsons. Fifth, no recognition of pro-slavery men except as ruffians, outlaws, and criminals. Sixth, abrupt discontinuance of subscriptions in pro-slavery newspapers. Seventh, the great possible encouragement to free white labor. 8. No more hiring of slaves by non-slaveholders. 9th, immediate death to slavery, or, if not immediate, unqualified proscription of its advocates during the period of its existence. 10th, tax of $60 on every slaveholder for each and every Negro in his possession at the present time, or at any indeterminate time between now and the 4th of July, 1863, said money to be applied to the transportation of the blacks to Liberia or to their colonization in Central or South America or to their comfortable settlement within the boundaries of the United States. 11th, an additional tax of $40 per annum to be levied annually on every slaveholder for each and every Negro found in his possession after the 4th of July, 1863, said money to be paid into the hands of the Negroes to be held in slavery or in cases of death to their next of kin, and to be used by them at their own option. This, then, is the outline of our scheme for the abolition of slavery in the Southern states. Let it be acted upon with due promptitude, and as certain as truth is mightier than error, 15 years will not elapse before every foot of territory, from the mouth of the Delaware to the embroguing of the Rio Grande, will glitter with the jewels of freedom. Sometime during this year next, or the year following, let there be a general convention of non-slaveholders from every slave state in the Union to deliberate on the momentous issues now pending. First, let them adopt measures for holding in restraint the diabolical excesses of the oligarchy. Secondly, in order to cast off the thraldom which the infamous slave power has fastened upon them, and as the first step necessary to be taken to regain the inalienable rights and liberties which they were invested in by nature, but of which they have been divested of by the accursed dealers in human flesh, let them devise ways and means for the complete annihilation of slavery. Thirdly, let them put forth an equitable and comprehensive platform fully defining their position and inviting the active sympathy and cooperation of the millions of downtrodden non-slaveholders throughout the southern and southwestern states. Let all these things be done, not too hastily, but with calmness, deliberation, prudence, and circumspection. If it need be, let the delegates to the convention continue in session 1 or 2 weeks, only let their labors be wisely and thoroughly performed. Let them on Wednesday morning present to the poor whites of the South a well-digested scheme for the reclamation of their ancient rights and prerogatives, and on the Thursday following, slavery in the United States will be worth absolutely less than nothing. For then, besides being so vile and precarious that nobody will want it, it will be a lasting reproach to those in whose hands it is lodged. Were it not that other phases of the subject admonish us to be economical of space, we could suggest more than a dozen different plans, either of which, if scrupulously carried out, would lead to a wholesome, speedy, and perfect termination of slavery. Under all the circumstances, however, it might be different for us. Perhaps it would not be the easiest thing in the world for anybody else, and to suggest a better plan than the one above. Let it, or one embodying its principal features, be adopted forthwith, and the last wail of slavery will soon be heard, growing fainter and fainter, till it dies utterly away, to be succeeded by the jubilant shouts of emancipated millions. Henceforth, let it be distinctly understood that ownership in slaves constitutes ineligibility, that it is a crime, as we verily believe it to be, to vote for a slaveocrat for any office whatever. Indeed, it is our honest conviction that all the pro-slavery slaveholders, who are alone responsible for the continuance of the baneful institution among us, deserve to be at once reduced to a parallel with the basest criminals that lie fettered within the cells of our public prisons. Beyond the power of computation is the extent of the moral, social, civil, and political evils which they have brought and are still bringing on the country. Were it possible that the whole number could be gathered together and transformed into 4 equal gangs of licensed robbers, ruffians, thieves, and murderers, society, we feel assured, would suffer less from their atrocities than it does now. Let the wholesome public sentiment of the non-slaveholders be vigilant and persevering in bringing them down to their proper level. Long since, and in the most unjust and cruel manner, have they socially outlawed the non-slaveholders. Now security against further oppression and indemnity for past grievances make it incumbent upon the non-slaveholders to cast them into the identical pit that they dug for their betters, thus teaching them how to catch a Tatar. At the very moment we write, as it has been the case ever since the United States have had a distinct national existence, and as will always continue to be the case unless right triumphs over wrong, all the civil, political, and other offices within the gift of the South are filled with Negro-nursed incumbents from the ranks of that execrable band of misanthropes. 347,000 is the number, who for the most part obtain their living by breeding, buying, and selling slaves. The magistrates in the villages, the constables in the district, the commissioners of the towns, the mayors of the cities, the sheriffs of the counties, the judges of the various courts, the members of the legislatures, the governors of the states, and the representatives and senators in Congress are all slaveholders, nor does the catalog of their usurpations end here. Through the most heart-sickening arrogance and bribery, they have obtained control of the general government and all the consuls, ambassadors, envoys, extraordinary, and ministers plenipotentiary who are chosen from the South and commissioned to foreign countries are selected with special reference to the purity of their pro-slavery antecedents. If credentials have ever been issued to a single non-slaveholder of the South, we are ignorant of both the fact and the hearsay. Indeed, it would be a very strange thing if this much abused class of persons were permitted to hold important offices abroad when they are not allowed to hold unimportant ones at home. And then there is the presidency of the United States, which office has been held 48 years by slaveholders from the South and only 20 years by non-slaveholders from the North. Nor is this the full record of oligarchical obtrusion. On an average, the offices of Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War, Postmaster General, and Attorney General have been under the control of slave drivers nearly two-thirds of the time. The Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, the Presidents pro tem of the Senate, and the Speakers of the House of Representatives have, in a large majority of instances, been slave breeders from the southern side of the Potomac. 5 slaveholding presidents have been reelected to the Chief Magistracy of the Republic, while no non-slaveholder has ever held the office more than a single term. Thus we plainly see that even the non-slaveholders of the North, to whose freedom, energy, enterprise, intelligence, wealth, population, power, progress, and prosperity our country is almost exclusively indebted for its high position among the nations of the earth, have been arrogantly denied a due participation in the honors of federal office. When the sum of all villainies shall have ceased to exist, the rights of the non-slaveholders of the North, of the South, of the East, and of the West will be duly recognized and respected, not before. With all our hearts we hope and believe it is the full and fixed determination of a majority of the more intelligent and patriotic citizens of this republic that the presidential chair shall never again be filled by a slavocrat. Safely may we conclude that the doom of the oligarchy is already sealed with respect to that most important and dignified station. It now behooves us to resolve with equal firmness and effect that after a certain period during the next decade of years, no slaveholders shall occupy any position in the cabinet, that no slave breeder shall be sent as a diplomat to any foreign country, that no slave driver shall be permitted to bring further disgrace to either the Senate or the House of Representatives, that the Chief Justices, Associate Justices, and judges of the several courts, the governors of the states, the members of the legislatures, and all the minor functionaries of the land shall be free from the heinous crime of ownership in man. For the last 68 years, slaveholders have been the sole and constant representatives of the South. And what have they accomplished? It requires but little time and few words to tell the stories of their indiscreet and unhallowed performances. In fact, with what we have already said, gestures alone would suffice to answer the inquiry. We can make neither a more truthful nor emphatic reply than to point out to our thinly inhabited states, to our fields despoiled of their virgin soil, to the despicable price of land, to our unvisited cities and towns, to our vacant harbors and idle water power, to the dreary absence of shipping and manufacturing, to our unpensioned soldiers of the Revolution, to the millions of living monuments of ignorance, to the poverty of whites, and to the wretchedness of the blacks. Either directly or indirectly, our slave-driving demagogues who have ostentatiously set up pretenses to the statesmanship responsible for every dishonorable weakness and inequality that exists between the North and the South. Let them shirk the responsibility if they can, but it is morally impossible for them to do so. We know how ready they have always been to cite the numerical strength of the North as a valid excuse for their inability to procure appropriations from the general government for purposes of internal improvements, for the establishment of lines of ocean steamers to South America and European ports, and for the accomplishment of other objects. Before that apology escapes from their lips again, let them remember that the numerical weakness of the South is wholly attributable to their own villainous statism. Had the Southern states, in accordance with the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, abolished slavery at the same time as the Northern states, there would have been, long since and most assuredly at this moment, a larger, wealthier, wiser, and more powerful population south of the Mason-Dixon line than there is now north of it. This fact, being so well established that no reasonable man now denies it, is the evidence that the oligarchy will have to devise another subterfuge for even temporary relief. Until slavery and slaveholders cease to be the only favored objects of legislation in the South, the North will continue to maintain the ascendancy in every important particular. With these loathsome objects out of the way, it would not take the non-slaveholders of the South more than a quarter of a century to bring her up, in all respects, to a glorious equality with the North, nor would it take them much longer to surpass the latter, which is the more vigorous and honorable rival that they have in the world. 3/4 of a century hence, slavery is abolished within the next 10 years as it ought to be. The South will, we believe, be as much greater than the North as the North is now greater than the South. 3/4 of a century hence, if the South retains slavery, which God forbid, she will be to the North much the same as Poland is to Russia, that Cuba is to Spain, or that Ireland is to England. What we want and must have are the only sure means of attaining to a position worthy of sovereign states in this eminently progressive and utilitarian age, is the energetic, intelligent, enterprising, virtuous, and unshackled population, an untrammeled press, and the freedom of speech. For ourselves as white people, and for the Negroes and other persons, whatever color or condition, we demand the rights, interests, and prerogatives that are guaranteed to the corresponding classes of mankind in the North, in England, France, and Germany, or in any other civilized and enlightened country. Any proposition that may be offered conceding less than this demand will be promptly and disdainfully rejected. Speaking of the non-slaveholders of the South, George M. Weston, a zealous co-laborer in the cause of freedom, says, "The non-slaveholding whites of the South, being not less than 7/10 of the whole number of whites, would seem to be entitled to some inquiry into their actual condition, and especially as they have no real political weight or consideration in the country, and little opportunity to speak for themselves. I have been for 20 years a reader of Southern newspapers, and a reader and hearer of congressional debates, but in all that time I do not recollect ever to have seen or heard these non-slaveholding whites referred to by Southern gentlemen as constituting any part of what they call the South. When the rights of the South, or its wrongs, or its policy, or its interests, or its institutions are spoken of, reference is always intended to the rights, wrongs, policies, interests, and institutions of 347,000 slaveholders. Nobody gets into Congress from the South but by their direction. Nobody speaks at Washington for any Southern interest except theirs. Yet there is at the South quite another interest than theirs, embracing from 2 to 3 times as many white people, and as we shall presently see, entitled to the deepest sympathy and commiseration in view of the material, intellectual, and moral privations which it has been subjected to, and degradation to which it has already been reduced, and the still more fearful degradation with which it is threatened by the inevitable operation of existing causes and influences. The following extract from a paper on domestic manufacturers of the South and West, published by M. Tarver of Missouri, may be appropriately introduced in this connection. The non-slaveholders possess generally but very small means, and the land which they possess is almost universally poor and is so sterile that a scanty subsistence is all that can be derived in its cultivation, and the more fertile soil, being in the possession of the slaveholders, must ever remain out of the power of those who have none. The state of things is a great drawback and bears heavily upon and depresses the moral energies of the poorer classes. The acquisition of a respectable position in the scale of wealth appears so difficult that they decline the hopeless pursuit, and many of them settle down into habits of idleness and become the almost passive subjects of all of its consequences. And I lament to say that I have observed of late years that an evident deterioration is taking place in this part of the population, the younger portion of it being less educated, less industrious, and in every point of view less respectable than their ancestors. Equally worthy of attention is the testimony of Governor Hammond of South Carolina, who says, according to the best calculation, which in the absence of statistic fact can be made, that of the 300,000 white inhabitants of South Carolina, there are not less than 50,000 whose industry, such as it is, and compensated as it is not in the present condition of things, and does not promise to be hereafter adequate to procure them honestly such a support as every white person is and feels himself entitled to. And this, next to emigration, is perhaps the heaviest of the weights that press upon the springs of our prosperity. Most of these now follow agricultural pursuits in feeble yet injurious competition with slave labor. Some, perhaps, not more from inclination than from the want of the encouragement, can scarcely be said to work at all. They obtain a precarious subsistence by occasional jobs, hunting, by fishing, sometimes by plundering fields or folds, and too often by what it is, in its effects far worse, trading with the slaves and seducing them to plunder for their benefit. Conjoined with the sundry plain, straightforward facts which have issued from our own pen, these extracts show conclusively that immediate and independent political action on the part of the non-slaveholding whites of the South is, with them, a matter not only of positive duty, but also the utmost importance. And yet, it is in their power to rescue the South from the gulf of shame and guilt into which slavery has plunged her. But if they do not soon arouse themselves from their apathy, this power will be wrenched from them, and then, unable to resist the strong arm of the oppressor, they will be completely degraded to a social and political level with the Negroes, whose condition of servitude will, in the meantime, become far more abject and forlorn than it is now. In addition to the reasons which we have already assigned why no slaveocrat should in the future be elected to any office whatever, there are others that deserve to be carefully considered. Among these may be mentioned the ill-breeding and ruffianism of the slaveholding officials. Tedious indeed would be the task to enumerate all of the homicides, duels, assaults and batteries, and other crimes of which they are the authors in the course of a single year. To the general reader, their career at the seat of government is well known. There, on frequent occasions, choking with rage at seeing their wretched sophistries scattered to the winds by the sound, logical reasoning of the champions of freedom, they have overstepped the bounds of common decency, vacated the chair of honorable controversy, and in the most brutal and cowardly manner assailed their unarmed opponents with bludgeons, bowie knives, and pistols. Compared with some of the barbarisms at home, however, their frenzied onslaughts at the national capital have been but the simplest breaches of civil deportment. And it is only for the purpose of avoiding personalities that we now refrain from divulging a few instances of the unparalleled atrocities which they have perpetrated in the legislative halls south of the Potomac. Nor is it alone in the national and state legislatures that they substitute brute force for genteel behavior and acuteness of intellect. Neither courthouses, nor public streets, hotels, nor private dwellings, rum holes, or law offices are held sacred from their murderous conflicts about certain silly abstractions that no practical businessman ever allows to occupy his time or attention. They are eternally wrangling, and thus it is that recounters duels, homicides, and other demonstrations of personal violence, and they have become so popular in all slaveholding communities. A few years of entire freedom from the cares and perplexities of public life would, we have no doubt, greatly improve both their manners and their morals, and we suggest that it is a Christian duty which devolves on the non-slaveholders of the South to disrobe them of their mantle of office, which they have so long worn with disgrace to themselves, injustice to their constituents, and ruin to their country. But what shall we say of such men as Botts, Stewart, and McFarland of Virginia, of Rayner, Moorhead, Miller, Stanley, Graves, and Graham of North Carolina, of Davis and Hoffman of Maryland, of Blair and Benton of Missouri, of the Marshals of Kentucky, and of Etheridge of Tennessee? All these gentlemen and many others in the same school entertained, we believe, sentiments similar to those that were entertained by the immortal fathers of the Republic, that slavery is a great moral, social, civil, and political evil to be gotten rid of at the earliest practical period. And if they do, in order to secure our votes, it is only necessary for them to have the courage of their opinions to renounce slavery and to come out frankly, fairly, and squarely in the favor of freedom. To neither of these patriotic sons of the South, nor to any of the class which they belong, would we give any offense whatsoever. In our strictures on the criminality of pro-slavery demagogues, we have had heretofore and shall have hereafter no sort of reference to any respectable slaveholder, by which we mean any slaveholder who admits the injustice and inhumanity of slavery and who is not adverse to the discussion of measures for its speedy and total extinction. Such slaveholders are virtually on our side, that is, on the side of the non-slaveholding whites with whom they may very properly be classified. On this point, once and for all, we desire to be distinctly understood, for it would be manifestly unjust not to discriminate between the anti-slavery proprietor who owns slaves by law of entitlement and the pro-slavery proprietor who engages in the traffic and becomes an aider and abettor of the institution from sheer turpitude of heart. Hence the propriety of this special disclaimer. If we have a correct understanding of the positions which they assumed, some of the gentlemen whose names are written above gave during the last presidential campaign ample evidence of their unswerving devotion to the interests of the great majority of the people, the non-slaveholding whites, and it is our unbiased opinion that a more positive truth is nowhere recorded in Holy Writ than Kenneth Rayner uttered when he said in substance that the greatest good that could happen to this country would be the complete overthrow of slave-driving democracy, alias the Nigger Party, which has for its head and front the Richies and Wises of Virginia, and for its casual termination the Butlers and Quattlebaums of South Carolina. And this, by the way, is a fit occasion to call attention to the fact that slave-driving Democrats have been the perpetrators of almost every brutal outrage that has disgraced our halls of legislation, of countless instances of assault and battery, affrays, and fatal recounters that have occurred in the courthouses, capitals, and other public buildings in the southern states. We feel safe in saying that the aggressor, in at least 9 cases out of 10, has been a Negro-nursed adherent of modern, miscalled democracy. So, too, the challenger to almost every duel has been an abandoned wretch who, on many occasions during infancy, sucked the corrupt milk of slavery from the breasts of his father's sable concubines, and who has never been known to become weary of boasting of a fact that invariably impressed itself on the minds of his audience or observers the very first moment they laid eyes upon him, namely that he was a member of the Democratic Party. Brute violence, however, can hardly be said to be the worst characteristic of the slave-driving Democrat. His ignorance and his squalidity are proverbial. His senseless enthusiasm is disgusting. Peculiarly illustrative of the material of which sham democracy is composed was the vote polled at the 5 Points precinct in the city of New York on the 4th of November, 1856, when James Buchanan was chosen president by a minority of the people. We will produce the figures. 5 Points precinct, New York City, 1856. Votes cast, For James Buchanan, 574. John C. Fremont, 16. Millard Fillmore, 9. It will be recollected that Colonel Fremont's majority over Buchanan in the state of New York was between 78 and 79,000, and that he ran ahead of the Fillmore ticket to the number of nearly 151,000. We have not the shadow of a doubt that he is perfectly satisfied with Mr. Buchanan's triumph at the 5 Points, which, with the exception of the slave pens in the southern cities, is perhaps the most vile and heart-sickening locality in the United States. One of the most noticeable and commendable features of the last general election is this: almost every state whose inhabitants have enjoyed the advantages of free soil, free labor, free speech, free presses, and free schools, and who have in consequence become great in numbers, in virtue, wealth, and wisdom, voted for Fremont, the Republican candidate, who was pledged to use his influence for the extension of like advantages to other parts of the country. On the other hand, with a single honorable exception, all of the states which have got to hating everything with the prefix free, from free Negroes up and down through the whole catalog, free farms, free labor, free society, free will, free thinking, free children, and free schools, and which have exposed their citizens to all the perils of numerical weakness, absolute ignorance, and hopeless poverty, voted for Buchanan, the Democratic candidate who, in reply to the overtures of his slave-driving partisans, has signified his willingness to pursue a policy that would perpetuate and disseminate without limit the multitudinous evil of human bondage. Led on by a huckstering politician whose chief vocation at the time is the rallying of ragamuffins, shoulder strikers, and liquor house vagabonds into the ranks of his party, and who, as well known, receives from the agents of the slave power regular installments of money for his infamous purpose, a Democratic procession, exceedingly motley and unrefined, marched through the streets of one of the great cities of the North, little less than a fortnight previous to the election of Mr. Buchanan to the presidency, and the occasion gave rise on the following day to a communication in one of the morning papers, from which we make the following pertinent extract. While the Democrat procession was passing through the streets of this city a few days since, I could not but think how significant the exhalation of that ignorant multitude was of the ferocious triumphs which would be displayed if ever false democracy should succeed in throwing the whole power of the country into the hands of the slave oligarchy. It is melancholy to think that every individual in that multitude, ignorant and depraved though he may be, foreign perhaps in his birth, and utterly unacquainted with the principles upon which the welfare of the country depends, and hostile it may be to those principles, if he does understand them, is equal to in the power which he may exercise by his vote to the most intelligent and upright man in the community. Of this, indeed, it is useless to complain. We enjoy our freedom with the contingency of its loss by the acts of a numerical majority. It behooves all men, therefore, who have a regard to the common good, to look carefully at the influences which may pervert the popular mind, and this, I think, can only be done by guarding against the corruption of the individual's character. A man who has nothing but political business to attend to, I mean the management of elections, ought to be shunned by all honest men. If it were possible, he should have the mark of Cain put upon him, that he may be known as a plotter against the welfare of his country. That less than 3% of those who voted for Colonel Fremont, that only about 5% of those who gave their suffrages to Mr. Fillmore, and that more than 18% of those who supported Mr. Buchanan were persons over 1 and 20 years of age who could not read and write, are estimates which we have no doubt are not far from the truth, and which, in the absence of reliable statistics, we venture to give, hoping by their publicity to draw closer attention to the fact that the illiterate foreigners of the North and the unlettered natives of the South were cordially united in their suicidal adherence to the nigger party. With few exceptions, all the intelligent non-slaveholders of the South, in concert with the more respectable slaveholders, voted for Mr. Fillmore. Certain rigidly patriotic persons of the former class, whose hearts were so entirely with the gallant Fremont that they refused to vote at all simply because they did not dare to express their preference for him from the exceptions which we allude. Through the Whig, Democratic, and Know Nothing newspapers in all of the states, free and slave denounced Colonel Fremont as an intolerant Catholic. It is now generally conceded that he was nowhere supported by the peculiar friends of Pope Pius IX. The votes polled at the Five Points precinct, which is almost exclusively inhabited by low Irish Catholics, show how powerfully the Jesuitical influence was brought to bear against him. All that delectable locality, as we have shown, the timid sage of Wheatland received 574 votes, whereas the dauntless finder of the empire received only 16. True to their instincts for freedom, the Germans generally voted the right ticket, and they will do it again and continue to do it. With the intelligent Protestant element of the fatherland on all sides, we can well afford to dispense with the ignorant Catholic element of the Emerald Isle. In the influences which they exert on society, there is no little difference between slavery, popery, and Negro-driving democracy, that we are not at all surprised to see them going hand in hand in their diabolical works of inhumanity and desolation. There is indeed no lack of evidence to show that the Democratic Party of today is simply and unreservedly a sectional nigger party. On the 15th of December, 1856, but a few weeks subsequent to the appearance of a scandalous message from an infamous governor of South Carolina recommending the reopening of the African slave trade, Emerson Etheridge of Tennessee, honor to his name, submitted in the House of Representatives the following timely resolution. Resolved that the House regard all suggestions or propositions of every kind by whomsoever made for the revival of the slave trade as shocking to the moral sentiments of the enlightened portion of mankind, and that any act on the part of Congress legislating for, conniving at, or legalizing that horrid and inhuman traffic would justly subject the United States to the reproach and execration of all civilized and Christian people throughout the world. Who voted for this resolution, and who voted against it? Let the yeas and nays answer. They are on record. And he who takes the trouble to examine them will find that the resolution encountered no opposition worth mentioning, except from members of the Democratic Party. Scrutinize the yeas and nays on any other motion or resolution affecting the question of slavery, and the fact that a majority of the members of this party have uniformly voted for the retention and extension of the sum of all villainies will at once be apparent. For many years, the slave-driving Democrats of the South have labored most strenuously, both day and night, we regret to say how unsuccessfully, to point out the abolition proclivities in the Whig and Know Nothing parties, the latter of which is now buried, and deservedly so deep in the depths of the dead that it is quite preposterous to suppose it will ever see the light of resurrection. For the truckling concessions to the slave power, the Whig party merited defeat, and defeated it was, and that too in the most decisive and overwhelming manner. But there is yet in the party much vitality, and if its friends will reorganize, detach themselves from the burden of slavery, espouse the cause of the white man, and hoist the fair flag of freedom, the time may come, at a day by no means remote, when their hearts will exult in the triumph over the ruin of the miscalled democracy. It is not too late, however, for the Democratic Party to secure to itself a pure renown, and an almost certain perpetuation of its power. Let it at once discard the worship of slavery and do earnest battle for the principles of freedom, and it will live victoriously to a period far in the future. On the other hand, if it does not soon repudiate the fatal heresies which it has incorporated into its creed, its doom will be inevitable. Now, the one thing Helper got definitely wrong here was he misunderstood the fact that because Thomas Jefferson had opened the borders in 1802, that the Democrats, no matter what they did wrong or what they did right, could only increase their share of the vote because their vote increases with every immigrant that comes over, which is why the Democrats have always been the party of open borders. That was why, dating back to Alexander Hamilton, one tenet of conservatism always was immigration restriction, because the Democratic Party always grows with the population, and the population that grows usually in any country is usually the population of the poor and less able. And that's just a fact. So, until the black flag entirely disappears from its array, we warn the non-slaveholders of the South to repulse and keep it at a distance, as they would the emblazoned skull and crossbones on the flag of the pirate ship. With regards to the sophistical reasoning which teaches that abolitionists, before abolishing slavery, should compensate the slaveholders for all or any of the Negroes in their possession, we have perhaps said quite enough. But wishing to brace our arguments in every important particular with unequivocal testimony from men who are accustomed to regard as models of political sagacity and integrity from Southern men as much as possible, we herewith present an extract from a speech delivered in the Virginia House of Delegates, January 20th, 1832, by Charles James Faulkner, whose sentiments, as then and there expressed, can hardly fail to find a response in the hearts of every intelligent, upright man. But, sir, it is said that society, having conferred this property on the slaveholder, it cannot now take it from him without an adequate compensation, by which is meant full value. I may be singular in the opinion, but I defy the legal research of the House to point me to a principle recognized by the law, even in the ordinary course of its adjudications, where the community pays for property which is removed or destroyed, because it is a nuisance and found injurious to that society. There is, I humbly apprehend, no such principle. There is no obligation upon society to continue your rights one moment after it becomes injurious to the best interests of society, nor to compensate you for the loss of that, the deprivation of which is demanded by the safety of the state, and in which general benefits you participate as a member of the community. Sir, there is to my mind a manifest distinction between condemning private property to be applied to some beneficial public purpose and condemning or removing private property which is ascertained to be a positive wrong to society. It is a distinction which pervades the whole genius of law and is founded upon the idea that any man who holds property injurious to the peace of that society of which he is a member thereby violates the condition upon the observance of which his right to the property alone is guaranteed. For property of the first class condemned, there ought to be compensation, but for property of the latter class, none can be demanded upon principle, none accorded as a matter of right. It is conceded that at this precise moment of our legislation, slaves are injurious to the interests and threaten the subversion and ruin of the Commonwealth. Their present number, their increasing number, all admonishes us of this. In different terms and in more measured language, the same fact has been conceded by all who have yet addressed the House. Something must be done, emphatically exclaimed the gentleman from Dinwiddie, and I thought I could perceive a response to that declaration in the countenance of a large majority of this body. And why must something be done? Because if not, says the gentleman from Campbell, the throats of all the white people of Virginia will be cut. No, says the gentleman from Dinwiddie, the whites cannot be conquered, the throats of the blacks will be cut. It is a trifling difference, to be sure, sirs, and matters not to the argument, for the fact is conceded that one race or the other must be exterminated. Sir, such being the actual condition of the Commonwealth, I ask if we would be justified now, supposing all the considerations of policy and humanity concurred, without even a moment's delay, in staving off this appalling and overwhelming calamity. Sir, if this immense Negro population were now in arms, gathered into black and formidable masses of attack, would that man be listened to who spoke about property, who prayed you not to direct your artillery or such a point for you would destroy some of his property? Sir, to the eyes of the statesman, as to the eyes of the omniscience, dangers presenting and dangers that must necessarily press are alike present. With a single glance he embraces Virginia now, with the elements of destruction reposing quietly upon her bosom, and Virginia is lighted from one extremity to the other with the torch of servile insurrection and massacre. It is not sufficient for him that the match is not yet applied. It is enough that the magazine is open and that the match will shortly be applied. Sir, it is true in national as well as private contracts that loss and injury to one party may constitute a fair consideration as gain to the other. Does the slaveholder, while he is enjoying his slaves, reflect upon the deep injury and incalculable loss which the possession of that property inflicts upon the true interests of the country? Slavery, it is admitted, is an evil, as an institution which presses heavily against the best interests of the state. It banishes free white labor. It exterminates the mechanic, the artisan, and the manufacturer. It deprives them of occupation. It deprives them of bread. It converts the energy of the community into indolence, its power into imbecility, its efficiency into weakness. Sir, being thus injurious, have we not a right to demand its extermination? Shall society suffer that the slaveholder may continue to gather his crop of human flesh? What is his mere pecuniary claim compared with the great interests of the common weal? Must the country languish, drop, die, and the slaveholder may furnish? Shall all the interests be subservient to one, all rights subordinate to those of the slaveholder? Has not the mechanic, have not the middle classes their rights incompatible with the existence of slavery? Sir, so great and overshadowing are the evils of slavery, so sensibly are they felt by those who have traced the causes of our national decline, so perceptible to the poisonous operations of its principles and the varied and diversified interests of the Commonwealth, that all whose minds are not warped by prejudice or interest must admit that the disease has now assumed that mortal tendency as to justify the application of any remedy which, under the great law of the state, we might consider advisable. From the abstract of our plan for abolition of slavery, it will be perceived that so far from allowing slaveholders any compensation for their slaves, we are, and we think justly, in favor of imposing on them a tax of $60 for each and every Negro now in their possession, and also for each and every one that shall be born to them between now and the 4th of July, 1863, after which time we propose that they shall be taxed $40 per annum annually for every person by them held in slavery, without regard to age, sex, color, or condition, the money of both instances to be used for the sole advantage of the slaves. An addendum to this proposition, we would say, in our opinion, that if slavery ought not to be totally abolished by the year 1869, the annual tax ought to be increased from $40 to $100, and furthermore, that if the institution does not then almost immediately disappear from under the onus of increased taxation, the tax ought to, in course of 1 or 2 years hereafter, be augmented to such a degree it will, in harmony with other measures, prove an infallible death blow to slavery on or before 4th of July, 1876. At once, let the good and true men of this country, the patriot sons of the patriot fathers, determine that the sun, which rises to celebrate the centennial anniversary of our national independence, shall not set on the head of any slave within the limits of our republic. Will not the non-slaveholders of the North, South, East, and West heartily, unanimously sanction this proposition? Will it not be cheerfully endorsed by many of the slaveholders themselves? Will any respectable man enter a protest against it? On the 4th of July, 1876, sooner if we can, let us make good, at least so far as we are concerned, the Declaration of Independence, which was proclaimed in Philadelphia on 4th of July, 1776, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is right for the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government laying on its foundation such principles and organizing powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In purging our land of the iniquity of Negro slavery, we will only be carrying on the great work that was so successfully commenced by our noble sires of the Revolution. Some future generation may possibly complete the work by annulling the last and least form of oppression. To turn the slaves away from their present homes, away from all the property and means of support which their labor has mainly produced, would be unpardonably cruel, exceedingly unjust. Still more cruel and unjust would be, however, to the non-slaveholding whites, no less than to the Negroes, to grant further toleration to the existence of slavery. In any event, come what will, transpire what may, the institution must be abolished. The evils, if any, which are to result from its abolition, cannot by any manner of means be half as great as the evils which are certain to overtake us in case of its continuance. The perpetuation of slavery is the climax of iniquity. 237 years have the Negroes in America been held in human bondage. During the whole of this long period, they have toiled unceasingly, from the gray of dawn till the dusk of eve, for their cruel taskmasters, who have rewarded them with scanty allowances of the most inferior qualities of victuals and clothes, with heartless separations of the tenderest ties of kindred, with epitaphs, with scoldings, with execrations, and with the lash, and not unfrequently with the fatal bludgeon or the more deadly weapon. From the labor of their hands and from the fruit of their loins, the human mongers of the South have become wealthy, insolent, corrupt, and tyrannical. In reason and in conscience, the slaves might claim from their masters a much larger sum than we have proposed to allow them. If they were to demand an equal share of all the property, real and personal, which has been accumulated or produced through their efforts, heaven, we believe, would recognize them as honest claimants. Elsewhere we have shown by just and liberal estimates that on the single score of damages to lands, the slaveholders are at this moment indebted to the non-slaveholding whites in the extraordinary sum of $7,554,148,825. Considered in connection with the righteous claim of wages for services which the Negroes might be to bring against their masters, these figures are the heralds of the significant fact that if strict justice could be meted out to all parties in the South, the slaveholders would not only be stripped of every dollar, but they would become in law, as they are in reality, the hopeless debtors of the myriads of unfortunate slaves, white and black, who are now cringing and fawning and festering around them. In this matter, however, so far as has wrong triumphed over right, that the slaveholders, a mere handful of tyrants whose manual exercises are wholly compromised in the use they make of instruments of torture, such as whips, clubs, bowie knives, and pistols, have, as a result of a series of acts of their own villainous legislation, become the sole and niggardly proprietors of almost every important item of Southern wealth. Not only do they own all the slaves, none of whom any really respectable person cares to own, but they are also in possession of the more valuable tracts of land and the appurtenances thereto belonging, while the non-slave-holding whites and the Negroes, who compose at least 9/10 of the entire population and who are the actual producers of every article of merchandise, animal, vegetable, and mineral, that is sold from the South, are most wickedly despoiled of their fruits of their labors and cast into the dismal abodes of extreme ignorance, destitution, and misery. For the services of the blacks from the 20th of August, 1620, up to the 4th of July, 1863, an interval of precisely 242 years, 10 months, and 14 days, their masters, if unwilling, ought to, in our judgment, be compelled to grant them their freedom, and to pay each and every one of them at least $60 cash in hand. The aggregate sum thus raised would amount to about $245 millions, which is less than the total market value of 2 entire crops of cotton, one half of which sum would be amply sufficient to land every Negro in this country on the coast of Liberia, whither, if we had the power, we would ship them all within the next 6 months. As a means of protection against the exigencies which might arise from a sudden transition from their present homes in America to their future homes in Africa, and for the purpose of enabling them there to take the initiatory steps in the walk of civilized life, the remainder of the sum, say about $122 millions, might very properly be equally distributed amongst them after their arrival in the land of their fathers. Dr. James Hall, the secretary of the Maryland Colonialization Society, informs us that the average cost of sending Negroes to Liberia does not exceed $30 each, and it is his opinion that arrangements might be made on an extensive plan for conveying them thither at an average expense of not more than $25 each. The American colonialization movement, as now systemized and conducted, is simply an American humane farce. At present, the slaves are increasing in this country at the rate of nearly 100,000 per annum. Within the last 10 years, as it will appear below, the American Colonialization Society has sent to Liberia less than 5,000 Negroes. Emigrants sent to Liberia by the American Colonialization Society during the 10 years ending January 1st, 1857. In 1847, 39, 1848, 213, in 1849, 454, 1850, 590, in 1851, 279, 1852, 568, 1853, 583, 1854, 783, 1855, 207, 856, 544. So it's at a total of 4,280 immigrants, and that's just counting over those 10 years. The average of this total is precisely 428, which may be said to be the number of Negroes annually colonized by the society, while the yearly increase of slaves is purely stated as little less than 100,000. Fiddlesticks for such colonialization. Once for all, within a reasonably short period, let us make the slaveholders do something like justice to their Negroes by giving each and every one of them his freedom and $60 in current money. Let us charter all the ocean steamers, packets, and clipper ships that can be held on liberal terms and keep them constantly plying between the ports of America and Africa until all of the slaves shall enjoy freedom in the land of their fathers. Under a well-devised and properly conducted system of operation, but a few years would be required to redeem the United States from the monstrous curse of Negro slavery. Some few years ago, when certain ethnographical oligarchs proved to their own satisfaction that the Negro was an inferior type of mankind, they chuckled wonderfully and avowed in substance that it was right for the stronger race to kidnap and enslave the weaker, that because nature had been pleased to do a trifle more for the Caucasian than for the African, the former, by virtue of its superiority, was perfectly justifiable in holding the latter in absolute and perpetual bondage. No system of logic could be more antagonistic to the spirit of true democracy. It is probable that the world does not contain two persons who are exactly alike in all respects, yet all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All mankind may or may not be the descendants of Adam and Eve. In our own humble way of thinking, we are frank to confess we do not believe in the unity of the races. This is a matter, however, which has little or nothing to do with the great question at issue. Aside from any theory concerning the original parentage of the different races of man, facts, material and immaterial, palpable and impalpable, facts of the eyes and facts of the conscience, crowd around us on every hand, heaping proof upon proof that slavery is a shame, a crime, and a curse, a great moral, social, civil, and political evil, an oppressive burden to the blacks, and an incalculable injury to the whites, a stumbling block to the nation and an impediment to progress, a damper on all the noble instincts, principles, aspirations, and enterprises of men, and a dire enemy to every true interest. Waiving all counts, we have, we think, shown to the satisfaction of every impartial reader that, as elsewhere stated, on the single score of damages to lands, slaveholders are at this moment indebted to us, the non-slaveholding whites, in the enormous sum of nearly $7,600 millions of dollars. What shall be done with this amount? It is just. Shall payment be demanded? No. All the slaveholders in this country could not pay it, nor shall we ever ask them for such a moiety of the amount. No. Not even for a dime, nor yet for a cent. We are willing to forfeit every farthing for the sake of freedom. For ourselves, we ask no indemnification for the past. We only demand justice for the future. But sirs, knights of bludgeons, chevaliers of bowie knives and pistols, and lords of the lash, we are unwilling to allow you to swindle the slaves out of all the rights and claims to which as human beings they are secretly entitled. Not alone for ourselves as for the individuals, but for others, particularly for the 5 or 6 million of Southern non-slaveholding whites, whom your iniquitous statism has debarred from almost all of the mental and material comforts of life, do we speak when we say you must emancipate your slaves and pay each and every one of them at least $60 in hand. By doing this, you will be restoring to them their natural rights and remunerating them at the rate of less than 26 cents per annum for the long and cheerless period of their servitude, from the 20th of August, 1620, when on the James River in Virginia they became the unhappy servants of heartless masters. Moreover, by doing this, you will be performing but a simple act of justice to the non-slaveholding whites, upon whom the institution has weighed scarcely less heavy than upon the Negroes themselves. You will also be applying a saving balm to your own outraged hearts and consciences, and your children, Yourselves, in fact, freed from the accursed stain of slavery, will become respectable, useful, and honorable members of society. And now, sirs, we have thus laid down our ultimatum. What are you going to do about it? Something dreadful as a matter of course. Perhaps you will dissolve the Union again. Do it if you dare. Our motto, and we would have you to understand it, is the abolition of slavery and the perpetuation of the American Union. If by any means you do succeed in your treasonable attempts to take the South out of the Union today, we will bring her back tomorrow. If she goes away with you, she will return without you. Do not mistake the meaning of the last clause of the last sentence. We could elucidate it as thoroughly as no intelligent person could fail to comprehend it, but for reasons which may hereafter appear, we forego the task. Henceforth, there are other interests to be consulted in the South, aside from the interests of Negroes and slaveholders. A profound sense of duty incites us to make the greatest possible efforts for the abolition of slavery. An equally profound sense of duty calls for a continuation of these efforts until the very last foe of freedom shall be utterly vanquished. To the summon of the righteous monitor within, we shall endeavor to prove faithful. No opportunity for inflicting a mortal wound in the side of slavery shall be permitted to pass us unimproved. Thus, terror engenders of the South. Here have we fully and frankly defined our position. We have no modifications to propose, no compromises to offer, nothing to retract. Frown, sirs, fret, foam, prepare your weapons, threat, strike, shoot, stab, bring on civil war, dissolve the Union, nay, annihilate the solar system, if you will. Do all this, more, less, better, worse, anything, do what you will, sirs. You can neither foil nor intimidate us. Our purpose is as firmly fixed in the eternal pillars of heaven. We have determined to abolish slavery, and so help us God, abolish it we will. Take this to bed with you tonight, sirs, and think about it. Dream over it, and let us know how you feel in the morning. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It by Hinton Rowan Helper. Chapter 3, Southern Testimony Against Slavery. If it please the reader, let him forget all that we have written on the subject of slavery. If it accord with his inclination, let him ignore all that we may write hereafter. We seek not to give currency for our peculiar opinions. Our greatest ambition in these pages is to popularize the sayings and admonition of wiser and better men. Miracles, we believe, are no longer wrought in this bedeviled world, but if, by any conceivable or possible supernatural event, the great founders of the Republic, Washington, Jefferson, Henry, and others, could be reinvested with corporal life and returned to the South, there is scarcely a slaveholder between the Potomac and the mouth of the Mississippi that would not burn to pounce upon them with bludgeons, bowie knives, and pistols. Yes, without adding another word, Washington would be mobbed for what he has already said. Were Jefferson now employed as a professor in a Southern college, he would be dismissed and driven from the state, perhaps murdered, before he reached the border. If Patrick Henry were a bookseller in Alabama, though it might be demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had never bought, sold, received, or presented any kind of literature except Bibles and Testaments, he would first be subjected to the ignominy of a coat of tar and feathers, and then limited to the option of unceremonious extirpation or death. How seemingly impossible are these statements, and yet how true. Where do we stand? What is our faith? Are we a flock without a shepherd, a people without a prophet, a nation without a government? Has the past, with all its glittering monuments of genius and patriotism, furnished no beacon by which we may direct our footsteps in the future? If we but prove ourselves true and worthy of our ancestry, we have nothing to fear. Our revolutionary sires have devised and bequeathed to us an almost perfect national policy. Let us cherish and defend and build upon the fundamental principles of that policy, and we shall most assuredly reap the golden fruits of unparalleled power, virtue, and prosperity. Heaven forbid that a desperate faction of slaveholding criminals should succeed in their infamous endeavors to quench the spirit of liberty which our forefathers infused into those two sacred charts of our political faith, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Oligarchical politicians are also responsible for the continuance of African slavery in the South. For purposes of self-aggrandizement, they have kept learning and civilization from the people. They have willfully misinterpreted the national compacts, and they have outraged their own conscience by defending to their illiterate constituents that the founders of the Republic were not abolitionists. When the dark clouds of slavery, error, and ignorance shall have passed away, and we believe the time is at hand when they are to be dissipated, the freemen of the South, like those of other sections, will learn the glorious truth that inflexible opposition to human bondage has formed one of the distinguishing characteristics of every really good or great man that our country has ever produced. The principles, aims, and objects that actuated the framers of the Constitution are most graphically and eloquently set forth in the following extract from a speech recently delivered by the Honorable A.H. Cragen of New Hampshire in the House of Representatives. When our forefathers reared the magnificent structure of a free republic in this western land, they laid its foundations broad and deep in the eternal principles of right. Its materials were all quarried from the mountains of truth, and as it arose majestically before an astonished world, it rejoiced the hearts and hopes of mankind. Tyrants only cursed the workmen in their workmanship. Its architecture was new. It had no model in Grecian or Roman history. It seemed a paragon, let down from heaven to inspire the hopes of men and to demonstrate the favor of God to the people of a new world. The builders recognized the rights of human nature as universal. Liberty, the great first right of man, they claimed for all men, and claimed it from God himself. Upon this foundation they erected the temple and dedicated it to liberty, humanity, justice, and equality. Washington was crowned its patron saint. The work completed was the noblest effort of human wisdom, but it was not perfect. It had one blemish, a little spot, the black stain of slavery. The workmen, the friends of freedom everywhere, deplored this. They labored long and prayerfully to remove this deformity. They applied all the skill of their art, but they labored in vain. Self-interest was too strong for patriotism and love of liberty. The work stood still, and for a time it was doubtful whether the experiment would succeed. The blot must remain or the whole must fall. The workmen revarnished their work to conceal and cover up the stain. Slavery was recognized but not sanctioned. The word slave or slavery must not mar the Constitution. So great an inconsistency must not be proclaimed to the world. All agreed at that time that the anomaly should not increase, and all concurred in the hope and belief that the blemish would gradually disappear. Those noble men looked forward to a time when slavery would be abolished in this land of ours. They believed that the principles of liberty were so dear to the people that they would not long deny to others what they claimed for themselves. They had never dreamed that slavery would be extended, but firmly believed it would wholly be blotted out. I challenge any man to show me a single patriot of the Revolution who was in favor of slavery or who advocated its extension. So universal was the sentiment of liberty then that no man, north or south, could be found to justify it. Some palliated the evil and desired that it might be gradually extinguished, but more contemplated it as a permanent institution. Liberty was then the national goddess, worshipped by all the people. The people sang of liberty. They harangued for liberty. They prayed for liberty, and they sacrificed for liberty. Slavery was then hateful. It was denounced by all. The British king was condemned for foisting it upon the colonies. Southern men were foremost in entering their protest against it. It was then everywhere regarded as an evil and a crime against humanity. The fact is too palpable to be disguised. Slavery and slaveholders have always been a clog and a dead weight upon the government, a disgrace and a curse to humanity. The slaveholding Tories of the South, particularly of South Carolina, in their atrocious hostility to freedom, prolonged the arduous war of the Revolution from 2 to 3 years, and since the termination of that momentous struggle, in which, thank heaven, they were most signally defeated, it has been their constant aim and effort to subvert the dear-bought liberties which were achieved by the non-slaveholding patriots. non-slaveholders of the South. Up to the present period, neither as a body nor as individuals have you ever had an independent existence. But if true to yourselves and to the memory of your fathers, you in equal co-partnership with the non-slaveholders of the North will soon become the honored rulers and proprietors of the most powerful, prosperous, virtuous, free, and peaceful nation on which the sun has ever shone. Already has the time arrived for you to decide upon which basis you will erect your political superstructure. Upon whom will you depend for an equitable and judicious form of constitutional government? Whom will you designate as models for your future statesmen? Your choice lies between the dead and the living, between the Washingtons, Jeffersons, and Madisons of the past, and the Quattlebaums, the Quitmans, and the Butlers of the present. We have chosen, choose ye, remembering that freedom or slavery is to be the issues of your options. As a result of much reading and research and the expenditure of no inconsiderable amount of time, labor, and money, we now proceed to make known the anti-slavery sentiments of these noble abolitionists, the fathers of the Republic, whose liberal measures of public policy have been so criminally perverted by the treacherous advocates of slavery. Let us listen in the first place to the voice of him who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. 2. The voice of Washington. In a letter to John F. Mercer dated September 9th, 1786, General Washington says, I never mean, unless some particular circumstances should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by law.